You weren't real military, Dennis. Intelligence work, sitting behind a desk somewhere safe. Let's not pretend that's the same thing as what guys like me actually did. That was the sentence that changed everything. Not shouted, delivered instead with the particular casual confidence of a man who genuinely believed the hierarchy he just described, at my own daughter's anniversary dinner, in front of several of his own military colleagues. 2 weeks later, his newly assigned commanding officer stood in my living room, shook my hand with a grip that lingered a beat too long, and said, "Sir, it's an honor. I've read the after-action reports from your unit more times than I can count. My name is Dennis Sharp. I'm 68 years old, and I want to tell you the whole story, not just the ending, because I think the middle matters more than people expect it to. Welcome to Silent Honor, where we tell true stories about the quiet strength it takes to be underestimated by the people who need you most, and still choose to show up for them anyway." If you've ever had your service, your work, your entire contribution quietly ranked as somehow lesser by someone who never bothered to understand it, this story is for you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight, and hit subscribe, because you're going to want to see exactly what happened in my living room 2 weeks later. Let me start where this really begins. I spent 24 years in the Army, the majority of that career in military intelligence, work that took me into operational planning rooms rather than frontline combat positions, work that required a very different set of skills than the infantry roles some of my colleagues occupied, but work that, over the course of my career, directly shaped the safety and success of countless operations I was never physically present for. My wife Joan passed 6 years ago, and since then, I've lived alone in a modest house, keeping myself busy with woodworking, occasional consulting work for a defense contractor that still values my particular expertise, and the unhurried rhythm of a man who spent decades under considerable pressure and has genuinely earned a quieter chapter. My daughter Melissa married a man named Trent about 4 years ago, an infantry officer who has built, by most measures, a genuinely accomplished military career of his own. From our very first extended interactions, I noticed a particular dismissiveness in how Trent discussed intelligence work generally, a hierarchy he seemed to genuinely believe in, where combat arms roles represented real military service, and virtually every supporting role, including the specific intelligence work I'd spent my career doing, occupied a considerably lesser tier in his estimation. I want to be careful here, because I don't think Trent is fundamentally a disrespectful person. But over 4 years of marriage to Melissa, I noticed a specific pattern developing in how he discussed my career, a pattern that eventually culminated in the exact comment that set everything else in motion. There was a family dinner, about 2 years ago, when I mentioned, in passing, a particular intelligence assessment I'd contributed to years earlier, and Trent interrupted, not unkindly exactly, but with evident confidence, to note that intelligence work is important, sure, but it's not the same as actually being out there, boots on the ground, making the real calls under fire. There was a barbecue, about 18 months ago, when one of Trent's fellow officers, a captain named Reyes, asked me genuinely curious questions about the specific intelligence disciplines I'd worked in, and Trent, overhearing, redirected the conversation within minutes toward his own recent deployment, a pattern I'd noticed before but that struck me, that particular afternoon, as a specific kind of discomfort with any conversation that gave my career more than passing attention. There was a Veterans Day event, the following year, where I wore a small pin identifying my old unit, and a stranger asked me about it, genuinely curious, and Trent, standing nearby, answered before I could. Dennis was intelligence, different world than combat arms, definitely valuable, but not exactly the tip of the spear, a phrase he used often enough that I'd started to recognize it as his standard rehearsed way of placing my service into a category just below his own. There was a holiday gathering the following year when a family friend asked about my service, and Trent answered for me, quickly, "Dennis did intelligence stuff, desk work mostly, definitely a different world than what guys in combat arms deal with," a description accurate as far as it went, but delivered with a specific hierarchy embedded in the framing that I noticed, even then, without fully addressing it. There was an afternoon, About 8 months ago, when I overheard Trent on the phone with a fellow officer, through the open door during a visit, describing me as, "My father-in-law did intelligence work, decent guy, but not exactly real military, if you know what I mean. More of a support role than actual service." I stood in that hallway for a good 10 seconds, listening to my son-in-law describe 24 years of intelligence work that had directly shaped operations he himself likely benefited from without ever knowing the source, as somehow not real military service. And then I continued toward the kitchen, saying nothing about what I'd heard. He never knew I'd heard a word. I want to be clear about something. I wasn't angry at Trent in the way people are angry at strangers. Trent had built his own identity around combat arms service, a genuinely demanding and honorable path, and I think, understandably enough, given the specific culture he'd been trained within, he'd absorbed a hierarchy that placed his own role above others without ever actually investigating what those other roles, including mine, had actually involved or accomplished. The specific comment that set everything in motion happened at Melissa and Trent's anniversary dinner, attended by several of Trent's military colleagues, an evening where I was, once again, introduced somewhat peripherally as Melissa's father, the intelligence guy, before the conversation moved on to Trent's own more celebrated deployment stories. At one point, one of Trent's colleagues, a younger officer, asked me directly about my own service, and before I could answer substantively, Trent interjected, with the easy confidence of a man who'd made this particular assessment many times before. "Dennis wasn't real military, not in the way we mean it. Intelligence work, sitting behind a desk somewhere safe. Let's not pretend that's the same thing as what guys like me actually did." I want to be honest about what that specific dismissal did to me. Sitting at my own daughter's anniversary dinner, having spent 24 years contributing to operations whose actual outcomes I was rarely permitted to discuss in detail, work that had, on more than one occasion, directly prevented casualties among units I never met and would never be credited to publicly. I didn't correct him. I finished my meal, made polite conversation for the remainder of the evening, and drove home carrying a particular kind of quiet I didn't fully examine until I was sitting alone in my own house an hour later. Let me pause the story right here for just a second, because I want to ask you something, watching at home right now. Have you ever had your specific, hard-earned contribution ranked as somehow lesser by someone who never bothered to actually understand what it involved? How did you carry that dismissal, knowing the truth but choosing not to argue the point in the moment? Tell me in the comments, because I read every single one, and if this story is already feeling familiar, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, because what happened 2 weeks later is the part of this story you really don't want to miss. 2 weeks after that dinner, Trent called Melissa with unusual excitement, explaining that he'd just been assigned to a new command, working directly under a colonel named Richard Voss, a genuinely respected officer whose own career included extensive intelligence coordination experience earlier in his own service. Trent mentioned, almost in passing, that Colonel Voss wanted to meet the families of his new officers, a gesture apparently characteristic of how he built his command teams. I want to describe what happened when Colonel Voss arrived at my house, because it's the moment everything changed, and it began almost immediately. Trent brought Colonel Voss by on a Saturday afternoon, and as introductions were made, I noticed the colonel's expression shift the moment he heard my full name, a kind of stunned, searching recognition that made him pause mid-handshake with Trent to look at me directly. "Dennis Sharp," he said slowly. "Are you the same Dennis Sharp who ran intelligence coordination for the Highland Ridge operation back in the 90s? "I was," I said, and I want to note that I said it quietly, the same tone I might have used to mention the weather. Colonel Voss's hand was already extended toward me, and when I shook it, the grip lingered considerably longer than a standard greeting. "Sir, it's an honor. I've read the after-action reports from your unit more times than I can count. The intelligence assessment your team produced ahead of that operation is still referenced in advanced planning courses, one of the most thorough pieces of predictive analysis I've ever encountered in my entire career. I had no idea I'd actually get to meet the man behind it, let alone find out he's my new officer's father-in-law." What specifically do you remember about the assessment? I asked, genuinely curious now despite the strangeness of the moment. The terrain analysis mostly, Colonel Voss said. You predicted an enemy repositioning pattern 3 days before it actually happened, based entirely on supply line movement patterns. Nobody else on the planning team had thought to cross-reference that carefully. I've told that story to junior intelligence officers for years, always as an example of what genuinely rigorous analytical work looks like, though I never had a name to actually attach to it beyond the unit designation on the report. I hadn't realized that particular assessment traveled quite that far, I said, and I want to be honest that something in my chest, still carrying 2 weeks of accumulated hurt from Trent's comment, genuinely loosened hearing a stranger describe, with such specific accuracy, work I'd done decades ago and rarely discussed since. Do you know what happened because of that prediction? Colonel Voss continued. The unit adjusted their position 2 days before contact, avoiding what would have been a significantly more costly engagement. I know at least 4 men personally who came home because of the extra warning your assessment provided. I've always wondered whether the analysts behind it ever fully understood the actual downstream impact. Trent, standing nearby, had gone very still, his expression moving through several rapid transformations. Confusion, then a dawning, disbelieving recognition, then something that looked, unmistakably, like genuine discomfort as the pieces assembled themselves in real time. Sir, Trent said carefully, I think there might be some confusion. Dennis did intelligence work, desk-based mostly. I wasn't aware his specific contributions were. Captain, Colonel Voss said, his tone shifting slightly, something firmer entering his voice now. With respect, I don't think you fully understand what your father-in-law's work actually involved. The Highland Ridge operation succeeded with minimal casualties precisely because of intelligence work this specific man led. I personally know officers who credit their entire units coming home safely to assessments produced by his team. That's not desk work in any diminished sense of the term. That's exactly the kind of work that determines whether combat operations succeed or fail before a single boot ever hits the ground. The room had gone quiet by that point, Melissa standing near the doorway, having overheard enough of the conversation to understand something significant was unfolding in her own living room. I want to tell you honestly what happened in me in that moment, because I think it matters. Something that had been quiet for decades opened its eyes, not with vindication exactly, but with a kind of tired, unexpected clarity, the specific stillness of a man watching a stranger extend, unprompted, exactly the recognition his own son-in-law had dismissed 2 weeks earlier. The weeks that followed were their own kind of complicated. There's a version of this story where that living room moment is the climax, and everything after is a footnote. But that's not how these things actually resolve, and I want to be honest about that. Real resolution is slow. It's Trent calling me the following day, his voice unsteady in a way I hadn't heard from him before. Dennis, he said, sitting across from me at my own kitchen table, I need to actually understand how badly I misjudged what you did. Colonel Voss doesn't hand out that kind of praise casually. I've served under him for 2 weeks and I've never heard him speak about anyone else's work with that kind of specificity. I've never made much of it, I said. That's rather the point. The work mattered to me because it mattered, not because I needed anyone's recognition of it years later. I called it not real military, Trent said quietly, at my own anniversary dinner, in front of my colleagues. I think I've spent my whole career assuming combat arms was the only category that actually counted, and I never once thought to ask real questions about what intelligence work like yours actually accomplished. That's an honest thing to notice, I told him. I'd rather have that than a comfortable excuse. I watched Trent, in the weeks after that, do something I hadn't fully seen him do before. He began asking genuine questions about my career, about the specific mechanics of intelligence work, questions that came from actual curiosity, rather than the dismissive assumptions he'd previously carried. At a subsequent gathering, when a colleague made a similar dismissive comment about intelligence work in front of him, Trent corrected it directly, describing, with newfound specificity, exactly what work like mine had actually accomplished. I didn't feel triumphant when the whole situation finally settled. I want to be honest about that too. I felt tired. The particular tired that comes after finally setting down a dismissal you'd carried quietly for years. I thought about Joan a great deal in those weeks, wondering what she would have made of watching our son-in-law finally reckon with an assumption he'd carried, largely unexamined, right up until Colonel Voss's recognition forced the reckoning into the open in my own living room. It's been almost a year now. Trent and I have a considerably more genuine relationship now, built on actual understanding rather than an unspoken hierarchy he'd never bothered to question. Colonel Voss and I have kept in touch, an unlikely friendship built on decades-old work neither of us expected to discuss again in quite this way. I think about that anniversary dinner often now, sitting in my workshop some evenings, genuinely content with a career very few people who meet me casually would ever guess still shapes military planning courses today. How much of the people we work alongside we simply never fully see, not because they're hiding anything deliberately, but because we've already decided, based on a narrow category, exactly what shape someone's contribution is allowed to take. Trent looked at my service for years and saw desk work, safely removed from real risk. He wasn't entirely wrong that my specific role looked different from his own. He was wrong about nearly everything else. I don't regret the years of not insisting Trent fully understand the actual weight of my career before that dinner forced the issue. What I've learned, watching him genuinely reckon with the gap between his assumption and the actual reality, is that sometimes the people we love need direct, undeniable evidence before an abstract truth about someone's actual contribution finally has room to land. If this story reminded you of a moment when someone ranked your service or your work as somehow lesser without actually understanding it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if you believe every quiet contribution deserves to be seen for what it actually accomplished, hit subscribe, because we've got a new story like this one for you every single week.